Hi, good morning, and we're here to share with you my guest today, Dr. Kirby Rosplock. She is the founder of Tamarind Learning, and I think we've known each other now since 2015. And it's a bit of a funny story how we met. Back in the 70s, 1978, I believe, in February, just before that, my father speculated using futures. I guess that's where I got some of my investing side from, that Chrysler with Lee Iacocca was not going to go into receivership. And he did quite well with that trade. And as a reward, he took our family, my grandmother included, for a 3-week trip to San Diego, California. And it was it was very eventful. We lost our baggage traveling through Chicago. And when we got to San Diego, I guess the year previously, there was a famous song written, "It never rains in sunny California, it pours." And for, more than 2 weeks of the 3, it was raining. And we try to drive to Disneyland each day, and mudslides would happen. And we could never make it up the highway to Anaheim. We finally got there at the end, but it was a real challenge. And where we stayed was this Hilton Hotel on Mission Bay, where really I think the first triathlons actually were created. And fast forward to 2015, and I'm part of this group called the Family Firm Institute, and they were holding their global conference at the same hotel in San Diego that I attended with family in 78. And I thought I had to go back. And there I am at the event, and there was this card being handed around about this upcoming book that was being released in a few months called The Complete Family Office Handbook. And it was written by this professional, Kirby Rosplock, and I was very fortunate just to meet her briefly at that event, and we've met thereafter at industry events. But it was really something that tied me to Kirby, and I know, Kirby, you've been in the family office business and industry for quite some time, but really your journey began a lot before coming to the industry. Can you maybe share a bit more about your family and growing up, and why the interest in this area and the passion in this area?
Surely. And Arthur, thank you for just letting me be an interloper guest on your podcast, because I really enjoy listening to your great podcasts and you have great guests. So I'm thrilled to be here. So my interest in the family office space stems mainly because I, like a lot of folks who actually go into psychology and therapy, was trying to figure out kind of what was going on in my own family, but also just because it was taboo for me really to even think I would have a right or some opportunity to come into our family's complex businesses and wealth. And why was it taboo? Because my family made its wealth in timber. I joke a lot about this, saying that they're lumberjacks, but not lumberjills. And, women just really were sidelined and not expected to participate in anything business related. And it really created a interesting sort of social divide within the fabric of our family, as my grandfather had 4 daughters, my mom being the second oldest. And so she, always had this really interesting childhood of watching her father run the businesses. But again, her and her sisters were never going to be a part of that. And so when she married, then my father went in and worked in the business for many, many years, most of his actual working career. And so did many of the other son-in-laws. So again, just watching all the women, just sort of watching at a distance, but playing a pretty important role, which is keeping sort of the social fabric of the family together. Now, fast forward to me, I was sort of passionate around wanting to help my family, but again, was pretty much at a distance. So I did sort of my own path and focused more on other aspects of wealth and enterprise, and sort of forayed into academia a bit at Marquette University, and also became sort of overeducated as I was thinking a lot about closing the gap on what I felt insufficient, right? I did have that sort of imposter syndrome feeling. So, MBA, PhD, just felt like I needed to prove to myself, prove to my family, and prove to so many others that I actually could contribute. I missed a board meeting, a shareholder meeting, and subsequent board meeting where there's some things going on in our family, and I was actually nominated by my immediate branch to represent our family's interests on the board.
How old were you then in that case?
I'm well into adulthood now, so I'm
Okay.
at that time I was working in a multifamily office. I was actually working on the manuscript and the contracting for the first handbook, and so I'm well into my 30s at this point. And maybe I'm just shy. I'm around 30, 35, somewhere in that range.
So you were doing a lot of board meetings already and participating in those types of things.
I was working in the business world. I was climbing the ladder. I was participating in, a lot of other family consultation and support. But honestly, up until that point, I was only a passive owner in my own family's enterprise. I was a shareholder. I was interested in leaning in, but not active. And so, in the flip of the switch of missing that shareholder meeting, I get put on the board. And for the first time in the 130 plus year history of the family business, again, started by my grandfather and his two brothers in upstate New York. And essentially, now I'm supposed to be a participant on the board. And it was kind of at that moment that I realized, even though I had like tons of academic knowledge and a lot of financial information and a lot of knowledge around sort of corporate America, working in a closely held small board environment where women had never graced prior, was that this was all new, really new for me. And so it was sort of a humbling moment where I realized I have to really listen and learn. And I also have to really recognize that I cannot participate in this board like I did when I was a shareholder. So I had to sort of partition what I heard on the board from even the rest of my immediate family and sort of sanitize, because there were decisions being made that really weren't privy to the rest of the family until the board was announcing, right, some of these decisions. So it was a really wonderful opportunity and experience. I just felt sad because it came when I had already moved on and I was already doing a lot of work with other families. And the other real sad part about it was I was on the board at a time when we were sort of unwinding a lot of our operating companies, selling them, liquidating. So that's dismantling a family enterprise is really, really devastating when it's like a big part of your identity, a huge part of your heritage.
I mean, if you've had the family enterprise for more than 100 years and multiple generations, what would cause a family to say, this is enough, we shouldn't be in this business any longer?
Well, there were certain financial situations within the family that required us to come up with cash. So we had to sell several businesses to meet tax burdens, levied from my grandparents' estate. There was, there was a lot of, at the time, there was a lot of downward pressure on building and materials and our industry. We were getting squeezed by, sort of big box retailers. So there were macro and micro issues on the business side, and then there were just wealth transfer issues. So that is really where the need to sell came up. But also, what happens in a lot of times with family, with multi-generational wealth and business, is it stops being the identity for a lot of the family, and they want financial freedom, not the ties that bind through closely held securities. They want liquidity. They want somewhat of freedom. And really my parents' generation never do that because we were, maybe wealthy on paper, but nobody was cash rich. Nobody had money in their pockets to sort of buy toys and do things. And so the opportunity to sort of allow people to do their own thing was really attractive at a time when we had these financial pressures and tax issues.
I think that goes for a lot of families. And I think Jay Hughes, the author and lawyer, wrote a piece and uses the term families of affinity, right? You want, this group within the family to want to work together on a consistent basis. And sometimes families get so disjointed, either due to personalities or passions where they want to pursue, it's hard to keep everything together forever.
Yeah, I mean, there's no script. And especially when, in our family, I didn't sense that there was always fresh, new advisors or insights that permeated into sort of our business system. So the board was extraordinarily loyal. We would, nominate and bring new people on occasion. But I also recall, the family's attorney that at the time he would be, 90 plus now, but had been there since my grandfather and maybe even all the way back to my great grandfather. So his span of advising the family had gone on for decades. So we'd seen many, many twists and turns and evolutions. And so again, there's continuity, but sometimes that continuity needs also fresh blood and fresh insights. And I think by the time the hand was extended to me and maybe other members of my generation, we'd all moved on. Like we'd all actually sort of created our own paths, our own careers. And it was almost like we missed passing the baton at the strategic times where engaging, inviting, and hopefully bringing in, if you want family leadership that's qualified, we miss those opportunities.
And you were seeing a lot of that probably in your role at the multifamily office that you were working at. I mean, you were head of education, and you dealt with a lot of the, I guess, most complex or sophisticated families in the United States. So I'm sure you were when you were trying to create these programs in education, routes for these families. You would take from learned experiences plus your own professional training and studies, and create programs that way. Is that what was going on?
Somewhat. I mean, I was lucky enough to work with a lot of different families who no fact pattern was identical, and that massively shaped sort of my thinking around how I consult, how I engage, but also what is needed. What are families missing when it comes to these critical ages and stages, be it the stage of the family business or the family wealth, be it the stage of parents and children. And so what I started to recognize is that none of us are sustainable, right? We all will be sometime in the ground, and we all have to sort of think beyond our own lifespan, because when this wealth endures, in my family, like, it's still enduring. It's manifested now in other sort of micro family businesses, right? Some family have ranches, some family have different enterprises. So, at the end of the day, I realized from sort of working with those initial families in the multifamily office space that there was no one provider and there was really no one consultant or advisor that could span the duration of the incredible wealth and business success that many of these families created. And so my interest always has been around truth and knowledge, tools and resources, and saying, what can, the old adage, don't give them a fish, teach them how to fish. What can we help families do that they can hopefully do for themselves and become self-sustaining. Because that's the key.
And you put that into a book, right? I mean, you wrote the complete family office handbook on what families should do to create that structure.
Yeah, it's one resource that hopefully gives, a more unbiased opinions, right? We don't sell any product, we don't provide any, I mean, we provide services, but you pay for who we are and what we're delivering. The book was really just trying to codify some great thinkers. Obviously, I wrote some of it, about half of it, and about half of it we got contributors from really wonderful experts in different bespoke areas. But again, if the book is the beginning, right? That's how do I socialize myself to the complexity that I'm really thinking about. And then the real work becomes when people start to actually build their plan and start to go to work to build out a structure.
And part of writing the book, did you find it cathartic at all? I mean, from what I understand, you were trying to look at whether do you create a professional single family office, or do you go the multifamily office route? Was that path, part of that book, and at least the first edition?
So I truthfully need to admit that part of the reason, so remember, if we go back to what I told you, I missed the board meeting because I was working on the book. Well, the reality was, right, when you create a lot of wealth in transition, many families like mine were faced with, do we build something? Do we join an MFO? Do we do it ourselves? What do we do after, some of these businesses turn over and there's liquidity? So I was actually diligencing from my own family, in part by writing this book, what all the opportunities, what are the different pathways, and could I provide sort of guidance to my family, but maybe other families about the options that are out there. And then I think the real reality is every family office is another family business. It's another business enterprise that needs to operate with the same kinds of metrics and performance parameters that you would with any business. So I'm not super excited about families who say, "Oh no, it's just a cost to us. It's just something we, need to maintain." And I'm like, "Well, will your next generation feel the same way? Because maybe you can justify it as like a luxury to have, but ultimately it really needs you need to test the mustard whether it can stand on its own."
Right. No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And after you're finishing the first edition, is that when you started to bring together Tamarind Partners and really put together this platform for families to learn who they are, learn how the different legal structures and terminology, and really begin to focus and work on that human capital side?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what I started to see in my family, but also in so many families, is that education is an afterthought. It's like, oh yeah, we got to get that. We should do that. Yeah, that's probably really important. Ironic, though, some of the most successful families are very purposeful around education as it relates to higher ed. Let's get them into the best high schools and colleges and universities. But when it comes to actually preparing and educating in-house about what they own, what they have, what they work so hard for, it's somewhat cavalier and ad hoc to what actually gets discussed and prepared and what doesn't. And so the more and more I looked at my own sort of family, my own journey, right? Getting to a board where I was super educated but felt super naive as it related to my own fact pattern, the more it became abundantly clear that there was this gap in the education world where we teach a lot about being operators. Are you good at management? Can you build a balance sheet? Do you have good ideas about business strategy? So we have all this purposefulness around doers, but then so many families don't have doers. They have beneficial owners. They have people that are coming in and are not going to be contributors. They're not going to build wealth. They're not going to, um, you know, be the ones to lead the next decade of the family business. But
So Laura Croft and Indiana Jones really are fictional. There's no families that they've got members like that can do everything.
well, there's some really gregarious family members, but let's count them as the exception, not the norm. And that's probably the biggest mistake families make, is that they they either don't cultivate the ones that could be exceptional early enough. So I look at, again, my family where we had really great, talented folks, and I was like the youngest in the generation. So really, it was not unusual that I was not really that identified as someone who could come in and lead, because I had cousins that were, as almost in age range of my youngest aunt. So that's, when the generations get very diverse and age wise. But I think most families end up cultivating beneficiaries, and then we need to figure out, what do they need to know? How is their journey purposeful? How do they contribute, even if it's not from an operator capacity? And so families oftentimes miss the opportunity to embolden their family systems by supporting these individuals.
Well, I mean, just look at politics today, and the lack of interest, and people don't vote, and they don't understand how the system works. And I presume that really translates to family too, right? You have a board or an opco or shares, and they really don't know how to communicate, and because they don't understand the structure.
Well, or they just honestly haven't been included, and that's okay. But it still requires them to have a tacit amount of knowledge about how it functions, what it does, what its purpose. If you're not on the board, how is your voice heard, and which other kinds of forums? What's the process that supports family governance, board governance, trust governance, operating entity governance? So again, there's just a bigger story that happens behind the scenes of most family businesses that rarely gets articulated. And even in the families themselves, it may not be organized.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So this platform you created, Tamarind Learning,
Mm-hmm.
could we take a look at that and maybe go through a few of the areas? We've got one Northland family now that's beginning to work through the program, and we've heard very, very positive things. So can we jump in there and maybe take a peek at it?
Absolutely. Happy to share. So again, this was motivated and inspired by a client that Tamarind worked with, probably 2016, 2017 vintage. And they had a really complex family system, a blended family with the needs of, very sophisticated and advanced trained family members to younger adult family members who are just fresh out of college and coming in. So when we first worked with them, we said, okay, how do we best support a really complicated family that has such diverse learning needs? And we actually built one sort of our first learning management system with that family, because we recognized that the boardroom actually wasn't a safe place for the family to learn. So they needed to be supported both wherever they were, and given the space and time to go through content at their leisure. So building a learning management system like Tamarind Learning has its roots right back into an actual case. And what we have today is, 3 generations away from what we created for that initial family, because we're like, how do we scale this? How do we make it more accessible? I'm currently logged into the Tamarind Learning Canada site, and this gives you a little peek at the dashboard. This is all live. I'm logged in as an administrator, but we have our courses. You can see how you do on your quizzes. There's a short quiz at the end of each module. We have a virtual online notebook. We have a document repository where people can upload and save their own stuff. They can save their homeworks. We have a dynamic discussion board if you're learning in a group, so you could learn with your sibling or your advisor. We have a place where you can host and save your meetings if you desire, a pretty expansive glossary, a whole online support mechanism. And, so there's a lot of cool features that we have by just, coming right in
And
here.
this is geared to Canadian families because Canadian tax law, trust law, it's very different than what I've studied in the United States. So you've created this just for Canadian families as well as your original for U.S. based families.
Correct. And so we will even build like our webinars. We hosted a recent advisor webinar right into our own actual structure. So the Accredited Beneficiary Stewardship Program is our flagship 10-course program that of each course area, there's anywhere from 1 to 4 modules. And then we broke this flagship program into 3 smaller programs. So if you only want to sort of have an onboarding on-ramp to Canadian stewardship, we cover what it means to be a beneficiary, a trustee, and sort of the basics of stewardship. This is sort of our technical program, which covers estate planning, trust, and tax. And you hit it right on the head, Arthur, that there are definitely a lot of differences between Canadian trust tax and estate planning than, say, the US. So it's really important to be able to sort of call out those specific areas. And then finally, we have a finance administration working with advisors and investing program. So this is a great place if you're more focused in those areas. And for those who are curious, you can actually jump in and do an online demo of our Canadian stewardship preview. So that's the first course to really get a sense of how our courses work. Each one of these tiles represents a course, and I'm happy to jump in or show you other aspects of the curriculum.
Question. So obviously this makes a lot of sense given that families are global nowadays. Canada's a big country. It's many hours or days drive from one side to the other. So you could have one group of the family maybe that lives in British Columbia working at the same time, as their cousins in Quebec or Ontario.
Exactly. I mean, I think the beauty of a virtual learning environment is that you can be anywhere, study and learn at any time, and go at your own pace. No one's looking over your shoulder. No one's judging you if you didn't raise your hand in that board meeting or whether you take the quiz 5 times to get a perfect score. This also allows families to emphasize what really matters to them. So what I might really care about, maybe Arthur, you don't. So I could go through and say, you know what, I am really excited about something I'm reading. So this is a sample curriculum. And you know what, this is telling me all about what is the definition of stewardship. And I want to hear more. I want to hear more Dennis Jaffe share his views on modern stewardship. So I can click here and I can jump into a new tab that gives me a whole podcast with Dennis talking about sort of his views. And this is, one of my mentors and greatest people I admire, written several books. You can read the transcript if you prefer. I think the beauty of what we've created is that it allows you to be inspired and to think about. It allows you to learn in a multimodal manner. That's a hard thing to say, multimodal manner. So you can learn reading, you can listen, you can see each page is narrated. I'm kind of scrolling down, but this is a sort of treatment that we use to bring to life the short sleeves to shirt sleeves paradigm. And I know folks can test this, right? But there is something to be said, whether it's because of poor communication, poor education, poor preparation. But a lot of families do struggle to maintain the core businesses or the core wealth if there is an intention, right, to maintain it. Mackenzie Scott is a great example of someone who, made tremendous wealth being a married in, and now she doesn't have the intentions, right, to pass that wealth to her progeny. She's giving it all away. So there's lots of interesting ways to use our system and bring it to life.
And this is a very different approach than great grandfather trying to rule from beyond the grave by locking up capital and trusts, right? It seems to be more about discussion and education and finding a common path forward as opposed to just restrictions. And I think what I've seen in my career is that when you do have that family buy-in, the likelihood of success goes up dramatically. Just using legal means doesn't really seem to be the way to hold on to wealth, right? You grab it too tightly, and it still will slip through your fingers like sand.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tremendous impermanence to financial capital. If we think about what happens on a daily basis in the stock market, to Bitcoin, to whatever you want to talk about,
Inflation.
inflation, financial wealth is somewhat like water. It can evaporate overnight. It can be a consistent flow if you manage it, if you're smart about it. It can also balloon, right? We've seen how many billionaires balloon their wealth in the last, stressful 5 years of the pandemic, and how lopsided, right? How much inequity we see in our world between the haves and the have-nots. I think all of these things create the need for us to sort of bring it back to who are we, where are we today, and what are we trying to achieve personally and individually, but then collectively. And, collective intentions don't manifest without intention. So if you want to bring family together to have a meaningful dialogue on what this means, what do we need to know, you need supporting tools and systems that are going to help family members get there.
No, absolutely. It's really a great first step. And then it's, putting that time in and working through each section, each project, at the family level. And the results are going to be different every time, I presume, given that each individual participating is different in each family, right? So, but you do end up on a path that's together much more so than disjointed. Now, you talked about the creation of wealth, and I know a lot of times people in the industry use the shirt sleeves in 3 generations. But there are entrepreneurial families that somehow borrow or access, family trusts or family capital. And I think, we call this family banks. And it's a chapter that you highlighted and went into quite a bit of detail in your book. But is that an approach that entrepreneurial families can utilize? So instead of putting money into a private equity fund or the stock market, how do you create that structure to have that next generation take that risk and try to grow the wealth again?
Yeah, I think family banks are a really interesting topic, and one that some families figure out are part of a bigger financial strategy, and something that can hopefully incent in the right kinds of ways family members to think entrepreneurial. I will say family banks work best when there's a culture of understanding what success looks like on the other side of using those funds. And in the Complete Family Office Handbook, Warner Babcock and I talk about sort of soft banks and hard banks. And when families are really, really rigid and professionalize a family bank, that basically we have to really train up family owners to think about, is that the best place for them to get capital, right? Because there's a lot more than just, if you fail, you know now you have to pay back, right? Or you got to liquidate other assets to pay back the loan that was extended to you. So we have to be mindful of how much is the bank set up to be a training ground, and there's some forgiveness if you're a startup or you're idea for a business falls through versus how rigid the expectation is on, achieving real returns, real success, paying it back. I mean, banks aren't like, oh, it's okay. If we think about commercial banks, they're pretty hardliners. If you come up to debt requirements and you don't make those or achieve those, they'll seize, right, the other assets to liquidate.
And it's most loans are full recourse in Canada, so it's hard to get away from the banks. So
Yeah.
they'll take your life savings and your house if you don't pay.
So my word of advice around family banks is be very clear with what success looks like. Build processes and metrics and expectations. But before you go and launch a bank, please, please, please become educated. Get your progeny well educated about the risks, the responsibilities, the process, and don't make your family bank their first loan. I mean, ideally, you would have them actually go out and try to seek other investments and other capital. Why? Because that raises the bar in their business plan and the efficacy of their business concept and idea and the likelihood of success. And sometimes when family actually go to their family bank first, and the family's like, sure, no problem, and without a lot of rigor behind why they're extending it, the requirements from a financial fiscal responsibility perspective, then we fall down. The bank falls down in terms of like not meaningfully holding to account the borrower, and that can create tremendous conflict.
And you've given them the money to Billy, right? So then Sally wants the money too.
Yeah, why can't you feed my pet project if you're feeding theirs? And wait a minute, I think mine's more socially responsible, therefore I should be entitled to. So it can create these tensions about, what's justified as, a good project. And that's why I'm saying have that criteria really well baked, and quite honestly, create buy-in by having stakeholders say, well, what do we need to do to raise the bar? Because there's only going to be so much capital, right, that would probably be lended through that kind of structure. So you don't want to make it too liberal, and then it's a land grab, and then there's internal fighting and competition in an unhealthy way.
I still have a lingering question about your family story. Did you end up creating a single family office, or did you go the multifamily route? And why did you choose that?
So we did all of the above. So when my family split, we had some family members go and set up their own single family offices. We had some family members go to sort of what I would call outsourced CIOs. Others sort of join more sort of traditional multifamily offices. And some are still kind of entrepreneurial do-it-yourselfers. So I can't say that the one thing I can say is we didn't choose to all invest together in, multiple generations and multiple branches saying, oh, we should pool our assets and do this by ourselves. To some degree, our family created enough wealth that a lot of them were like, we can just do this on our own.
And they love to do it. I suppose they get up every day and they want to talk about, the human capital side and grow that next generation, and then also invest it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think our generation is doing it differently. There's just, I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs in our family, but maybe not entrepreneurs in the sense of trying to build massive, huge enterprises, but smaller, more lifestyle, what I'll call lifestyle driven kinds of entrepreneurs who are making a very good living and supporting their own financial means. And then the multi-generational inherited wealth is just layered in. I think we all are growing our human capital by doing the things that we love and supporting our families to be sort of the best family members that we can be in that capacity. But at the end of the day, I do sense that there is just a really dynamic and evolving space, and really virtual and hybrid offices are more the norm than the exception.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So on that note, thank you so much for the time today and the insights, Kirby. I know our listeners will very much enjoy them. and we will be hopefully speaking with you again in the near future and hearing the great feedback from our families taking the Tamarind Learning Program.
Well, Arthur, it's a pleasure to be here and to be part of your podcast series. And we're excited to have you and your family as part of Tamarind Learning. And, really want to just share, there's so many great resources from the podcast library, like yours is free. There's access to a lot of different tools and materials that if people scope around, there's a newsletter, workbooks, and all kinds of tools that you can get access to even just start, right? The whole idea is just start the journey and get going and figure out how much you can do on your own, how much you can do with your advisor like Arthur, how much you need to help from us, and we're happy to support families as they're starting their journeys.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Kirby, and take care.